Today we're diving into three mysterious cases that intrigue investigators and fascinate people around the world. We'll explore the disappearance of Rui Pedro, a Portuguese boy whose case gained notoriety after alleged images of him were found on the dark web. The strange case of Juan Pedro Martinez, involving an inexplicable accident and circumstances that defy logic. And finally, the tragic story of Joan D'Alessandro, a young Girl Scout cookie seller whose fate shocked an entire community. Get ready to learn disturbing details, controversial theories, and enigmas that remain unanswered in these three cases that challenge our understanding. If you enjoy real mysteries and aren't subscribed to the channel yet, take the opportunity now to click the subscribe button and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos about mysterious cases like these. Rui Pedro.
Around 14 hours on an apparently ordinary afternoon, Rui Pedro Teixeira Mendonça, a boy of only 11 years, approached his mother with a simple request: permission to take a car ride with his friend Afonso Dias. Filomena, with her maternal instinct alerted, denied the request and suggested that her son play in the field behind the office where she worked. At 18 hours on that same day, the telephone rang. It was Rui's tutor informing that the boy had not shown up for his class. The boy's bicycle was found hidden among the bushes in the field where he was supposed to be playing. From that moment, a desperate search began that would extend for decades, with the boy being seen again only years later in obscure forums of the deep internet. Follow this report to understand how a simple request from a child to go for a car ride with a friend transformed into one of the most disturbing cases in Portugal, involving an international pedophile network, alarming police failures, and a mother who, even 24 years later, still maintains her son's room exactly as he left it on that fateful day in March of 1998. Rui Pedro Teixeira Mendonça was born on January 28, 1987, bringing happiness to his parents, Manuel and Filomena Teixeira. Along with his sister Karina, 3 years younger, he lived what seemed to be an idyllic life in the small town of Lousada, in the district of Porto, Portugal. He was an extraordinarily affectionate and cheerful child. His passion for animals was so intense that he assembled a genuine collection of birds at home, having to distribute some to his grandparents due to lack of space. On one occasion, his sensitivity became evident when he built a treehouse for a squirrel he had rescued, becoming completely devastated when the animal returned to nature the following day. Beyond his love for animals, the boy possessed a creativity that impressed everyone around him. Filomena loved to proudly tell how he improvised a television antenna using just a fork. And like many other children his age, Rui Pedro nurtured big dreams. He aspired to become a professional soccer player when he grew up. In 1995, a 21-year-old man named Afonso Dias began attending the driving school where Filomena worked. Coming from a modest background, Afonso was there to obtain his driver's license. No one could have predicted that this simple presence would become the central element of one of Portugal's greatest family tragedies. Initially, the connection seemed natural. Filomena, moved by the young man's difficult financial situation, began helping him with clothes and essential items. As a way of showing gratitude, Afonso began performing small tasks at the driving school to earn extra money. Gradually, he became a regular presence not only at the establishment, but also in the life of the Teixeira Mendonça family. The age difference between Afonso and Rui, 10 years, was justified by many due to the older one's behavior, considered immature. He has the same mental age as the children, people said. This argument, combined with Afonso's apparent kindness, allowed him to constantly gain the family's trust, especially Filomena's. The level of trust reached such a point that Afonso received permission to be alone with the children frequently. It was he who took Rui Pedro and Karina to school. The friendship between him and Rui Pedro seemed special in the eyes of many people. They were like brothers, according to Afonso himself, who claimed they maintained a fraternal relationship. However, not everyone viewed this closeness favorably. Manuel, Rui's father, and Jose, the maternal grandfather, frequently expressed their discomfort with the situation. For them, it was not natural for an adult man to spend so much time with a child. The fact that Afonso smoked in the boy's presence only increased their concern. The warnings from the father and grandfather were not ignored. Filomena, respecting her husband's concerns, began to impose limits on the time Afonso spent with the children. This decision, apparently prudent, may have been the trigger for even more disturbing events. In the weeks preceding the disappearance, witnesses reported subtle changes in Afonso's behavior. He began to demonstrate a growing obsession with Rui Pedro, frequently asking about his whereabouts and activities. Karina herself, Rui's sister, later revealed that Afonso had begun taking photographs of her and her brother, something he had never done before. What initially seemed to be an unlikely but innocent friendship began to show concerning signs. Secret meetings between Afonso and Rui, even after the restrictions imposed by the family, were reported by neighbors. Afonso's obsession with the boy was becoming increasingly evident, although at the time these signs were not interpreted as the prelude to the tragedy that was about to unfold. Later, during the investigations, it was discovered that Afonso had invited both Rui and his cousin Joel Andre to a disturbing encounter, to meet sex workers. This invitation, made to children of only 11 years, would prove to be just the tip of the iceberg of a much darker story. The proximity between Afonso and the Teixeira Mendonça family, built over 3 years, created a false sense of security that would ultimately prove fatal. The controversial friendship between a 21-year-old man and an 11-year-old boy would reach its tragic climax on March 4, 1998. What began as an ordinary Wednesday in Lousada, Portugal, would transform into day zero of one of the most disturbing cases in Portuguese criminal history. Around 14 hours after lunch, Rui Pedro made his last documented visit to his mother's office at the driving school. The objective was simple: to ask permission to go for a car ride with Afonso Dias, the same friend who, in the previous weeks, had shown a growing obsession with the boy. Filomena, following both her maternal intuition and the concerns previously expressed by her husband and father, denied the request. As an alternative, she suggested that her son play in the field behind the office, an area that, although surrounded by main roads, was considered safe and commonly used by local children. The sequence of events that followed remained subject to intense judicial scrutiny. 3 boys who were playing soccer in the field provided crucial testimony. Around 15 hours, a black Fiat Uno entered the dirt path. The driver was unequivocally Afonso Dias. Rui Pedro, after a brief conversation, entered the vehicle, leaving his bicycle behind. This testimony was later corroborated by a local firefighter, who also positively identified Afonso as the driver. The Fiat Uno in question belonged to Afonso's brother. According to later records, Afonso had asked to borrow the vehicle under the pretext of taking it for an annual government inspection, a commitment that never materialized. This detail would become yet another suspicious element in an increasingly complex plot. At 18 hours, the phone rang in Filomena's office. Rui's tutor was calling to inform that the boy had not shown up for his 17 hours class, an unprecedented absence, especially considering that these classes were essential to help him with his epilepsy condition. This call triggered the beginning of a search that would extend for decades. The mobilization was immediate. Neighbors, relatives, and friends spread throughout the village in search of any sign of the boy. It was during these initial searches that a disturbing discovery emerged. Rui's bicycle was strategically positioned among tall bushes, in an arrangement that suggested a deliberate attempt at concealment. A neighbor reported having noticed the bicycle in that location around 15 hours, a time that perfectly coincides with the reports of Rui being seen entering Afonso's car. When questioned by the police, Afonso presented a version that directly contradicted multiple testimonies. According to him, he had seen Rui for only 5 minutes, between 1350 and 1355, before driving alone to the neighboring town of Pacos de Ferreira. He claimed to have parked in front of a pharmacy, remained in the vehicle for an undetermined period, and subsequently walked around the city observing shop windows. Later, he supposedly went to Fremont, where his girlfriend lived, arriving at 1845. It was only at this moment, according to his account, that his sister informed him about Rui's disappearance. A particularly disturbing detail emerged during the initial interrogation. When confronted by Rui's grandfather, Jose, who offered a considerable amount of money for information about his grandson's whereabouts, Afonso began to cry and made an enigmatic statement. He said that if they wanted to find Rui, they should close the borders. This suggestion that the boy might be being transported out of the country would acquire an even more sinister meaning in the following years. Afonso's behavior during the first hours of the investigation caught the attention of investigators. He demonstrated an unusual calmness when denying his involvement, but became visibly disturbed when confronted with specific testimonies. Particularly revealing was his reaction to the testimony of Rui's cousin, Joel Andre, who revealed that on the day before the disappearance, Afonso had invited both him and Rui to meet prostitutes, a revelation that provoked an aggressive reaction from Afonso, who tried to intimidate Joel Andre into silence. March 4th, 1998 ended without answers, only with the haunting echo of a mother who had lost her son. Night fell over Lousada, but for the Teixeira Mendonça family, a darkness was beginning that would last for decades. The next confirmed sighting of Rui Pedro would occur only years later, under terrible circumstances, in obscure forums of the deep internet, revealing an even darker fate than anyone could have imagined on that fateful Wednesday. The negligence with which the Portuguese authorities conducted the Rui Pedro case would become one of the most outrageous aspects of this tragedy. Even with multiple testimonies pointing to a kidnapping, the police insisted on treating the case as a simple disappearance, as if the boy had just gotten lost and would soon return. The National Republican Guard, GNR, upon receiving the report, demonstrated a concerning lack of urgency. They did not isolate the area where the bicycle was found, did not collect fingerprints from the suspected vehicle, and did not even trace the mysterious call received by Filomena, where a child with a voice identical to Rui's desperately screamed for his mother. One of the most shocking episodes of the investigation occurred when Filomena was harassed by one of the judicial police inspectors during the initial investigations. The family would only discover years later that Portugal had specialized forensic units, resources that were never mobilized for the case. Even when evidence emerged that Rui might be being taken out of the country, the authorities did not activate border control. The police also refused to perform age progression on Rui's photos until 2007, keeping in circulation only images of him at 11 years old, a decision that made possible identifications much more difficult. When a source informed about a boy in a restaurant who had said, "I was also kidnapped. I am from Faith and nobody is looking for me," the authorities did not even investigate the tip. At another crucial moment, an anonymous call mentioned having seen Rui at a hotel in Spain, another clue ignored without any verification. An internal report discovered only years later revealed that several officers had refused to register reports that arrived after business hours, prioritizing administrative issues over the life of a missing child. As the investigation progressed, new crucial testimonies began to emerge, painting an even more disturbing picture of the case. The most impactful testimony came from Alcina Diaz, a sex worker who worked on National Road 106, near Lousada. Alcina revealed that on that fateful afternoon, a man in a black car stopped beside her, offering 1,000 escudos for her to have relations with a boy. The child, whom she later identified as Rui Pedro through newspaper photos, was visibly disturbed and crying. Showing compassion, Alcina took the boy to a more private area, where they talked for about 15 minutes. During this time, she did not touch him inappropriately, only tried to calm him down. The boy revealed that the man was his uncle, and that he was being forced to visit sex workers against his will. At a crucial point during the trial in 2011, Alcina, who had never seen Afonso in person before, immediately identified him in court as being the man who was with Rui that day. The identification was even more impactful because she had made no prior effort to see Afonso, although she had spoken with authorities on 3 different occasions. The investigation also revealed that, in the weeks before the disappearance, there were several attempts by Afonso to attract other children. Several minors from the region reported similar invitations, always involving car rides and suspicious promises. In September of 1998, 6 months after Rui Pedro's disappearance, an international operation against cybercrime discovered one of the largest and most disturbing child exploitation networks ever recorded, the Wonderland Club. This discovery would add an even darker dimension to the already tragic case of the Portuguese boy. The Wonderland Club operated in an era when the internet was still in its infancy, long before the emergence of the dark web as we know it today. It was a meticulously structured organization with an extremely restricted access system. To become a member, the candidate needed to be recommended by someone who already belonged to the group and contribute a minimum of 10,000 files at the time of their entry, a requirement that evidenced the systematic and organized nature of this criminal network. The magnitude of the operation shocked even experienced investigators. During the seizures, hundreds of thousands of media containing images and videos of more than 1,200 children being exploited were confiscated. It was, until then, the largest organized pedophilia scheme ever recorded in human history. Among the confiscated material, investigators found evidence that directly connected Rui Pedro's case to this international network. Not only photographs were discovered, but also an explicit video involving the Portuguese boy. To confirm his identity, a specialized facial mapping program was used, which compared the images with photographs of Rui before his disappearance. One of the most devastating aspects of this discovery was the identification process that the Teixeira Mendonça family had to go through. They had to submit to the painful procedure of examining the material to confirm if that child was really Rui. For Filomena, it was an agonizing moment of confirmation. Her son was alive when those images were made, but under terrible circumstances. Among those detained in the operation was Juan Sears, a 29-year-old man. In his computer, images of a boy identified as Billy were found, who would later be recognized as Rui Pedro. In 2001, after compiling a database with victims' faces, international authorities definitively established the connection between Billy and Rui Pedro. The discovery of the Wonderland Club revealed the existence of a criminal network that extended across more than 12 countries. Members not only shared illegal material but also organized themselves to produce new content, suggesting a sophisticated international child trafficking operation. The case gained even more complexity when Ian Baldock, Sears' accomplice, was interrogated by Interpol. Both denied knowledge about the origin of Rui Pedro's images, and, due to the quality of the photographs at the time, it was impossible to determine precisely when or where they were produced. The connection with the Wonderland Club transformed Rui Pedro's disappearance from a local case in Portugal to a crime of international dimensions. This discovery also shed light on a disturbing aspect of the case. Afonso Dias' initial statement about closing the borders now acquired a much more sinister meaning. Today, Rui Pedro remains on the list of the few positively identified children among the victims of the Wonderland Club. The discovery of this connection, although providing crucial evidence about his fate after the disappearance, also brought to light the terrible reality that the boy had been inserted into an international child exploitation network, a revelation that, although painful, confirms that Rui was alive months after his disappearance in Lousada. In 2011, 13 years after Rui Pedro's disappearance, the case would finally reach the courts. A new investigation team in Porto, upon re-examining the initial statements, found sufficient evidence for Portugal's Central Department of Investigation and Criminal Action to indict Afonso Dias for aggravated kidnapping, a crime characterized when the abduction lasts more than 24 hours, involves a minor under 18 years old, or is committed by a group. The trial, held at the District Court of Lousada, included more than 50 witnesses. One of the most striking situations was Afonso's attempt to avoid his presence in court. He presented an unusual justification. He claimed that he could not miss so much time from his work as a truck driver. When this strategy failed, he requested psychological tests, claiming to have cognitive difficulties that prevented him from situating himself in time and space. Both requests were denied. During the process, the defense presented a new and surprising line of argument. According to them, Afonso was being used as a scapegoat due to pre-existing family tensions, specifically a supposed jealousy that Manuel, Rui's father, allegedly had of Afonso's relationship with his wife and son. This theory was vehemently refuted by Manuel in his testimony. A crucial moment of the trial was the reconstruction of events. Judges, witnesses, and family members visited key locations in Lousada. Filomena and Karina, however, chose to remain in the car during the reconstruction, unable to relive that traumatic day once again. The first verdict, in February of 2012, shocked Portugal. Afonso was acquitted of all charges. The jury decided to reject the testimonies of the prosecution witnesses, including that of Alcina Diaz, prioritizing the defense's argument that the last person to see Rui Pedro had been his own mother. The decision sparked spontaneous protests in front of the court. The family appealed, arguing that the court had considered evidence that should have been excluded, such as the testimonies of 3 inspectors who had contributed little to the original investigation. These police officers testified only to cast doubt on the credibility of Alcina Diaz, reinforcing prejudices against sex workers. In 2014, after an intense legal battle, a new trial was held. Filomena's health, already fragile, deteriorated further as the process approached. She needed to be hospitalized and fed through a tube to gather strength to testify again. The second trial brought a different verdict, although not entirely satisfactory. Afonso was found guilty of attempting to corrupt a minor and of being the last person seen with Rui Pedro. However, he was not convicted of kidnapping due to the alleged lack of direct evidence. The sentence, 3 years and 6 months in prison. In March of 2015, after exhausting all possible appeals, Afonso finally began serving his sentence at Pacos de Ferreira prison. However, due to his good behavior, he was released just 2 years later, in March of 2017. Before his incarceration, Afonso gave a television interview that caused public outrage. With disturbing coldness, he declared he regretted nothing except getting involved with the Teixeira Mendonça family. He even suggested that the real culprit remained unpunished. When questioned about his enigmatic suggestion to close the borders on the day of the disappearance, he dismissed the comment as mere irony. After his release, Afonso returned to normal life, got married, and had a child. In subsequent interviews, he continued maintaining his innocence, claiming to have served time for a crime he did not commit. When confronted about his family's safety in the face of public outrage, he expressed concern about possible retaliation, although he stated that he would continue believing that Rui Pedro was alive until proven otherwise. The most important questions remain unanswered. Where is Rui Pedro, and what was his true fate after that March afternoon in 1998? For Filomena, the mother who never gave up looking for answers, Rui's room remains untouched, a time capsule preserving the last vestiges of her son. Her tireless fight for justice and for the truth about Rui Pedro's fate serves as a testimony to a mother's unconditional love, even in the face of the most devastating circumstances.
Juan Pedro Martinez. It was the early morning of the 25th of June 1986, around 6:40 in the morning. The tanker truck driven by Andres Martinez was advancing through the winding Somosierra mountain pass, north of Madrid, Spain. Inexplicably, the vehicle began to accelerate until it reached 120 kilometers per hour, an absurdly dangerous speed for a truck carrying 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid on a mountain road. What followed was a chaotic scene. The truck tried to overtake 3 other vehicles on a blind curve when a 4th truck appeared from the opposite direction. In the desperate attempt to avoid a head-on collision, Andres lost control. The enormous tanker truck skidded, overturned, and smashed against the mountain rocks. The violent impact opened the tank, spilling thousands of liters of highly concentrated sulfuric acid down the slope, creating a true environmental catastrophe as the corrosive chemicals flowed toward the Duratón River. When emergency services finally managed to reach the site, they found a devastating scene. Andres Martinez and his wife Carmen had died instantly. Their bodies, still in the twisted cabin of the truck, were partially corroded by the deadly acid. But what transformed this terrible accident into one of the most disturbing mysteries in recent European history was a chilling detail. Juan Pedro Martinez, the couple's 10-year-old son who was traveling with them that morning, had simply disappeared. There was no sign of the child, no body, no blood, no clothing, nothing. It was as if the boy had vanished into thin air, leaving behind more questions than answers. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscription button now, and activate the bell to receive notifications about new videos of mysterious cases. Juan Pedro Martinez was born in the tranquil city of Murcia in southern Spain on the 1st of October 1976. He was the only child of Andres Martinez, a dedicated truck driver, and Carmen Lopez, his wife. Despite being a family of modest means, the Martinez family didn't lack necessities, although they weren't rich either. Andres worked hard to support his family, making long truck journeys throughout Spain. In the summer of 1986, Juan Pedro had just finished the school year with excellent grades. As a reward for their son's effort, Andres and Carmen planned a small family trip. Andres needed to deliver a cargo to Bilbao in northern Spain, and saw in this professional obligation a perfect opportunity to provide his son with a new and exciting experience. Juan Pedro had never traveled to the north of the country, and dreamed of seeing the green pastures and mountains of the Basque country, a landscape completely different from the arid lands of Murcia. The plan was simple: the family would travel together in Andres' tanker truck. He would make the scheduled delivery in Bilbao, and then they would spend a few days exploring the region and the Atlantic Ocean before returning home. On the afternoon of the 24th of June 1986, around 7 o'clock, Andres loaded his truck with approximately 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid at 98% purity, an extremely dangerous, highly corrosive, and toxic substance. Despite the danger of the cargo, Andres was an experienced professional and trusted in his ability to transport it safely. Juan Pedro was radiant with happiness, dressed almost entirely in red, an unusual choice that would later be remembered by several witnesses. The boy's maternal grandmother was present to say goodbye, without imagining that this would be the last time she would see her daughter and grandson. Andres, as an experienced driver, carefully planned the route. He knew that the most challenging stretch would be the Somosierra Pass, a mountainous passage located north of Madrid. Strategically, he scheduled to pass through this stretch in the early morning hours, when traffic would be lighter, minimizing risks. During the journey, the family made several regulatory stops, as required by legislation for truck drivers' rest periods. Around 5 o'clock in the morning on the 25th of June, after passing through Madrid, the family stopped at El Mao restaurant for breakfast. The owner, Felipe, remembered the family perfectly. The parents had coffee, while Juan Pedro drank a glass of milk and ate a small sweet. This was the last time the family was seen together by an independent witness. After breakfast, around 6 in the morning, the Martinez family resumed their journey. What happened in the next 40 minutes remains one of the most intriguing aspects of this case. Upon reaching kilometer 95 of the old National Road 1, Andres' truck began to accelerate inexplicably. Witnesses on the road reported seeing the huge tanker truck reach extremely dangerous speeds, up to 120 kilometers per hour on a winding mountain road. In an attempt to overtake 3 trucks ahead of him, Andres reached even higher speeds, approximately 150 kilometers per hour. When he was about to overtake the last truck, a 4th vehicle suddenly appeared from the opposite direction. Andres tried to brake, but it was too late. The tanker truck collided with the rear of the first truck ahead, causing the cabin to separate from the tank, resulting in what experts call a scissor effect. The vehicle began to spin uncontrollably, colliding with the truck coming from the opposite direction. The result was catastrophic. The tanker truck overturned, spilling virtually all of the sulfuric acid. Andres was thrown from the cabin and died instantly upon hitting the asphalt. Carmen was trapped among the wreckage of the cabin, also lifeless. The driver of the truck coming from the opposite direction survived, although with both legs broken. The other 3 drivers involved in the accident suffered minor injuries. Up to this point, it's a terrible traffic accident, the kind that unfortunately occurs on the roads. However, shortly after the accident, witnesses observed something unusual. A white van, described as a Nissan Vanette without windows in the back, stopped near the destroyed cabin of Andres' truck. 2 individuals, described as a man and a woman of Caucasian appearance with very fair skin and blonde hair, exited the vehicle. According to witnesses, they quickly approached the cabin, picked up something or someone, and departed at high speed. 30 minutes later, when the civil guard arrived at the scene, they encountered a situation of extreme gravity. The spilled sulfuric acid was not only corroding everything around it, but also releasing toxic gases that made breathing difficult and irritated the eyes. The immediate concern became containing the spill, which threatened to contaminate the Duratón River and cause an even greater environmental disaster. After stabilizing the situation, the authorities were finally able to account for the victims of the accident. Andres and Carmen were dead, their bodies partially corroded by the acid. It was then that Juan Pedro's grandmother received the devastating news about the death of her daughter and son-in-law. Amid the crying, she asked, "And the lad?" An expression from southern Spain meaning, "And the boy?" It was at this moment that the civil guard discovered, astonished, that there was a third person involved in the accident, a 10-year-old boy. Immediately, a frantic search for Juan Pedro began. In the truck's cabin, they found children's clothing, toys, and even the sole of a child's shoe, confirming that the boy had been in the vehicle. However, there was no sign of him, neither alive nor dead. The authorities began to search the surrounding area, thinking that perhaps the boy had been thrown far during the impact, or that the parents had thrown him out the window to save him before the collision. However, days of intensive searching revealed no trace of Juan Pedro. One of the first hypotheses put forward by the authorities and quickly spread by the press was the macabre possibility that Juan Pedro's body had been completely dissolved by the spilled sulfuric acid. This theory gained momentum due to its dramatic nature and because it seemed to offer a simple explanation for such an inexplicable disappearance. However, this hypothesis was quickly refuted by chemistry experts. Although sulfuric acid at 98% purity is extremely corrosive, capable of causing severe burns on contact with human skin, it would be impossible for it to completely dissolve a human body in such a short time. Laboratory experiments demonstrated that, even immersed in concentrated sulfuric acid, an animal rib would take approximately 1 week to completely disintegrate. Additionally, materials such as teeth, plastic buttons, and certain fabrics are highly resistant to acid corrosion. If Juan Pedro had really fallen into the acid, his remains would have been found, just as his parents' bodies were located. The acid would have transformed the organic tissues into a characteristic black paste, but would not make them disappear without leaving traces. This realization only deepened the mystery if the boy had not been dissolved by the acid. Where was he? As the investigation progressed, the civil guard tried to reconstruct the events of that morning from the available evidence. One piece was the braking marks found on the road, indicating that Andres had tried to stop the vehicle right before the accident. This contradicted the initial theory of a brake failure in the truck. Another crucial element emerged when Juan Garcia Leaz, Carmen's brother and Juan Pedro's maternal uncle, became personally involved in the investigation. Dissatisfied with the authorities' progress, Garcia Leaz began his own search for answers. He discovered that, just 1 year before the accident, Andres had spent a considerable amount, approximately 4,000 euros converted from the currency of the time, on a complete overhaul of the truck. This made the hypothesis of mechanical failure even less likely. But the most disturbing discovery came from analyzing the truck's tachograph, a device that records data such as speed, stops, and braking. The records revealed that, in the short stretch between El Mau restaurant and the accident site, approximately 18 kilometers, Andres' truck had stopped no less than 12 times. The stops were brief, lasting only a few seconds each, except for the last one, which lasted 22 seconds. Right after this final stop, the truck accelerated dramatically, leading to disaster. This driving pattern was completely abnormal. For a large truck transporting a dangerous cargo, stopping and restarting repeatedly represented not only unnecessary wear, but also a significant risk. Additionally, the stretch was covered in 1 hour and 23 minutes, an excessively long time for the distance covered, indicating that Andres was driving exceptionally slowly before suddenly accelerating. It was from the analysis of these disconcerting data that one of the most persistent theories about the case emerged: the possibility that Juan Pedro had been kidnapped. According to this hypothesis, vehemently defended by his uncle Juan Garcia Leaz, Andres' truck was being deliberately held back by another vehicle traveling in front of him, forcing him to stop repeatedly. In the last stop, the longest, the occupants of that vehicle would have taken Juan Pedro hostage, possibly to force Andres to perform some illicit activity. Desperate upon seeing his son being taken, Andres would have then accelerated frantically, pursuing the kidnapper's vehicle, which would explain the suicidal speed on a dangerous mountain road. Eventually, he lost control and the fatal accident occurred. This theory gained strength with the testimonies of witnesses who saw the white van stop at the scene shortly after the accident, possibly to ensure that no compromising evidence remained in the truck's cabin. But what motive would someone have to kidnap the son of such a modest family? The answer, according to Garcia Leaz, was linked to organized crime and drug trafficking, activities that thrived in Spain in the 80s. He suspected that traffickers might have forced Andres to transport drugs, using his son as a guarantee that he would complete the task without alerting the authorities. This theory gained strength approximately 1 year after the accident, when, by order of Judge Maria Dolores Ruiz Ramos, the tanker truck was finally subjected to a thorough inspection. During the dismantling of the vehicle, investigators found traces of what could be heroin in a secret compartment of the tank. The material was carefully wrapped in a blanket, protected by a white tarp and yellow plastic, hidden in one of the rear compartments of the tank, covered above and below with sulfuric acid. The discovery was widely reported by the press, which quickly associated Andres with drug trafficking. However, the family vehemently contested these allegations. The owner of the tank, Antonio Madonjo, defended Andres' innocence, suggesting that he might have been coerced into transporting drugs under threat to his son's life. Juan Pedro's grandmother also categorically stated that Andres would never put his son in danger, even under extreme coercion. In the following years, Garcia Leaz himself modified his position, eventually questioning the validity of the tests that identified illicit substances in the truck. In later interviews, he suggested that the civil guards who inspected the vehicle might have made errors in the chemical tests. However, by dismissing the presence of drugs, he also weakened his own theory about the motive for the kidnapping. While the official investigation lost momentum, Juan Pedro's family, especially his uncle Garcia Leaz, maintained a tireless search. 85,000 posters with the boy's photo, taken during his first communion, wearing a sailor suit, were printed and distributed. The posters were spread throughout Spain, in schools, town halls, post offices, and various public establishments. The family traveled thousands of kilometers, examining every curve and every corner of the roads from the accident site to the confines of Burgos, hoping to find some trace. From time to time, reports of possible sightings emerged, but none materialized. One of the most intriguing clues emerged in 1987, approximately 1 year after the disappearance. The owner of a driving school in central Madrid reported that a blind elderly woman of Iranian origin had asked for information about the location of the United States Embassy. At her side was a boy of approximately 10 or 11 years old with an Andalusian accent, a region close to Murcia, who acted as her guide. What caught the man's attention was the contrast between the woman's foreign origin and the boy's regional Spanish accent. This story connected in a disturbing way with the reports about the Nissan Vanette vans seen at the accident site, where witnesses mentioned seeing an elderly woman waiting inside the vehicle while the Nordic-looking couple approached the crashed truck. However, like so many other clues in this case, this one also led nowhere. In 2015, almost 30 years after the disappearance, new hope arose when Juan Pedro's grandmother's DNA was compared with unidentified mortal remains found in Guadalajara through the Phoenix program, an initiative that maintains a genetic database for identifying missing persons. Once again, the results were negative. In 2016, 30 years after the accident, experts and witnesses recreated in detail the events of that fateful day, attempting to shed new light on the mystery. A judicial expert, Luis Alamancos, confirmed that the tanker truck was in perfect mechanical condition, reinforcing the theory that Andres' abnormal behavior at the wheel was not the result of technical failure, but possibly coercion or desperation. A particularly disturbing aspect of this case was the apparent lack of commitment from the authorities in resolving it. Garcia Leaz frequently criticized the civil guard and the police for not adequately investigating crucial leads. In particular, he questioned why the authorities had never made a systematic effort to identify the white Nissan Vanette vans seen at the site. According to his investigations, that specific model was relatively rare in Spain in 1986, with only about 8,000 units in circulation. It would have been perfectly feasible, he argued, to survey the owners of these vehicles and investigate their movements on the day of the accident. However, this line of investigation was never followed by the authorities. Garcia Leaz also claimed to have suffered threats and intimidation during his independent investigations. In several interviews, he mentioned receiving anonymous phone calls, pressuring him to abandon his search. These allegations fueled theories that the case might involve not just ordinary criminals, but possibly an organized crime network with influence over local authorities. The reluctance of the authorities to investigate certain lines of inquiry, combined with the speed with which the press associated Andres with drug trafficking, led many to suspect a cover-up. Some speculated that powerful figures might be involved in the case, either directly in Juan Pedro's disappearance or in the events that preceded it. A particularly relevant detail is that Andres was acquiring his truck from Antonio Madonjo for a considerable sum, 5 million pesetas, approximately $35,000 at the time. Additionally, he had recently invested 700,000 pesetas, approximately $4,900, in repairs to the gearbox and brakes. These financial circumstances generated speculation that Andres might be under significant economic pressure, potentially vulnerable to offers or coercion to transport illegal cargo. Almost 4 decades have passed since that fateful June morning in 1986, and the fate of Juan Pedro Martinez remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in European criminal history. Europol, the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement, Cooperation has classified the case as one of the most unsettling disappearances in Europe. But despite this, little progress has been made in its resolution. What happened to Juan Pedro? Was he kidnapped as part of a drug trafficking operation that went wrong? Did he somehow manage to survive the accident, only to get lost in the mountains, disoriented or suffering from amnesia due to a head trauma? Was he taken by well-intentioned people who, upon realizing the severity of his injuries, panicked and concealed him? Or is there an even more sinister explanation, involving human trafficking or organ harvesting? Unfortunately, as time passes, the chances of finding definitive answers diminish. Witnesses age or pass away, physical evidence deteriorates, and memories become less reliable. The case of Juan Pedro runs the risk of becoming just another urban legend, a sinister tale about a boy who disappeared into thin air, leaving behind only unanswered questions. However, the legacy of this case goes beyond the mystery itself. It serves as a somber reminder of the dangers of organized crime and the devastating impact it can have on innocent families. It also raises important questions about the effectiveness and integrity of criminal investigations, especially in complex cases that may involve powerful figures or obscure interests. For Juan Pedro's family, particularly for his uncle Juan Garcia Leas, who dedicated decades of his life and considerable resources to the search for answers, the case represents a wound that has never completely healed. The absence of a body to bury, a grave to visit, a definitive closure, makes grieving for Juan Pedro an endless journey, a pain that time may dull, but never completely heal. It is possible that one day new forensic technologies, advances in genetic databases like the Phoenix program, or even the late confession of someone involved in the case, will finally bring to light the truth about what happened to Juan Pedro Martinez that morning in Somosierra. Until then, his disappearance remains one of the most puzzling enigmas in modern criminology, a 10-year-old boy who literally disappeared into thin air. And so, we come to the end of another fascinating and disturbing case from criminal history. Joan D'Alessandro.
Imagine a 7-year-old Girl Scout in a quiet neighborhood on Holy Thursday of 1973. She leaves home with 2 boxes of cookies to sell, her uniform, and a smile. 2 hours later, she is no longer breathing. Her body would only be found on Easter Sunday, hidden under rocks in a distant park. What happened during that time? And how could her killer be the man who lived just a few steps from her house? This is the story of Joan D'Alessandro, the girl whose death would trigger one of the biggest changes in American legislation on crimes against children. April 19, 1973. Joan D'Alessandro, dressed in her Girl Scout uniform that she was so proud of, enters the house at 2:40 in the afternoon to tell her mother, "Mom, I'm going to the neighbor who bought the new car to sell just the last 2 boxes of cookies." Joan was known as the social butterfly of the school, always attentive to make sure no one was left alone, always mediating conflicts. The teacher said Joan had a gift for making friends and helping others. Those would be the last words her mother, Rosemary, would hear from her. When the girl didn't return after an hour, Rosemary wasn't immediately concerned. The Hillsdale neighborhood in New Jersey was considered extremely safe, so safe that even an FBI agent and a minister lived there. Children played freely in the streets. Everyone knew each other. But at 4:40 in the afternoon, when the piano teacher of Joan's older sister arrived, a dark premonition took hold of Rosemary. She began frantically calling her daughter's friends. No one knew where Joan was. The father, Frank D'Alessandro, an Italian with a normally reserved temperament, was visibly in shock. He immediately went out with his other 2 children, 8-year-old Mary and 9-year-old Frank Jr., to search for the girl in nearby neighborhoods. a crucial detail came back to Rosemary's memory. Joan had mentioned a neighbor with a new car. There was only one family in the neighborhood that had recently acquired an automobile, the McGowans. With her heart racing and a bad feeling, Rosemary went to their house, accompanied by her son. Something made her leave the boy in the yard, perhaps a maternal protective instinct, while she climbed the entrance stairs alone. Joseph McGowan, a 27-year-old science teacher, answered the door. "Was Joan here?" asked Rosemary, trying to keep her voice steady. "No," he replied dryly. But something in his eyes, in the coldness of his posture, made Rosemary's blood freeze. When he saw police officers arriving at his own door, McGowan just continued smoking his cigar, indifferent to the despair of the mother whose eyes were already overflowing with tears. He simply went upstairs, as if the unfolding drama did not concern him. Rosemary felt she needed to leave immediately. What she didn't know, what no one yet suspected, was that her little Joan had been dead for hours, and her killer had just closed the door. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, click the subscribe button now and activate the bell. Your support is fundamental for us to continue bringing cases like this. Soon after Rosemary realized her daughter was missing, hundreds of people mobilized to search for her. Neighbors, police officers, firefighters, and even Joseph McGowan himself, the actual killer, joined the search. Tracking dogs were taken to the family's laundry basket to pick up Joan's scent. Curiously, the dogs always went to the front door and the back door of McGowan's house where the garage was, but nothing was found at that time. The disappearance of a 7-year-old child quickly spread, and various TV stations and reporters arrived in the neighborhood. Rosemary didn't mind giving interviews to everyone, believing that the more people who saw her daughter's photo, the greater the chances of finding her. The father, Frank, made an emotional appeal on television. "If you have my daughter, please return her. There will be no charges, you won't be arrested. We just want our daughter back alive and well." The Hillsdale sheriff, who was on vacation, returned immediately when he learned about the girl's disappearance in the county he supervised. He went to the family's house, and although he also had the feeling that something terrible had happened, promised to do his best to find Joan without giving false hopes that everything would be all right. The case made local headlines. Rosemary gave interviews to any media outlet that appeared, desperate for someone, somewhere, to have seen her daughter. Frank, in a televised plea that broke hearts, looked directly at the camera. "If you have my daughter, please return her. There will be no charges, you won't be arrested. We just want our Joan back alive and well." His voice broke on the last sentence. 3 suspects initially emerged. 2 were quickly dismissed: a young man looking to rent a house in the area and a lost man walking around the neighborhood. The 3rd suspect was Joseph McGowan. During 2 days of interrogation, his answers crumbled under the weight of their own contradictions. He claimed not to be at home when Joan disappeared, saying he had gone to the market on foot, despite his car being in the garage. "Which market did you visit?" "I don't remember." "What did you buy there?" "Meat and apples." "Where are the receipts?" "I don't have them." "Where is the food?" "We've already eaten everything." McGowan had no alibi. His mother was at work when Joan disappeared. His grandmother, an extremely elderly, sick, and almost deaf lady, remained confined to her room on the upper floor of the house. Too convenient not to hear the screams that certainly occurred. Subjected to a lie detector, McGowan failed spectacularly. The investigators were direct. "You failed these specific questions. Do you want to tell us something?" McGowan hesitated, his face pale, and then made a surprising request. "Can I speak with a priest?" After a long conversation with the religious figure, the truth finally emerged in a horrifying confession. Yes, he had killed Joan. And worse, he had left her body in a park, across the border with the state of New York. Sheriff Farisco took on the most painful task: informing the parents. When he arrived at the D'Alessandro house, he found Rosemary accompanied by the local priest. Upon hearing that her daughter was dead, murdered by the neighbor, Rosemary exploded, "I want to kill." "Joseph, The priest tried to calm her, to which the sheriff himself retorted, "Father, how can she be calm? She just lost her daughter." On Easter Sunday, while families celebrated the resurrection, a police team and the medical examiner headed to the location indicated by McGowan. The contrast could not have been more cruel. Among the stones of a deserted park, under two large rocks with only a small exposed gap, they found what remained of Joan D'Alessandro. She was naked, her body already in sync with the ambient temperature, dead for at least 36 hours, which meant she had been murdered just a few hours after leaving her house on Thursday. The medical examiner, a father of 4 young children, would later describe that moment as one of the worst in his career. "I had to force myself to maintain professionalism," he confessed to colleagues, "but internally I was devastated. The site was overflowing with onlookers, press, agents, but the doctor firmly ordered, 'Get everyone out of here except essential personnel.'" Near the body, investigators found something disturbing, a plastic bag from a store called Mobio. Inside it were Joan's clothes, a pair of red and white sneakers, a turquoise t-shirt, brown pants, and her blood-stained underwear. What caught attention was how the pieces were carefully folded, as if the killer had all the time in the world. Before removing the body, a priest was called to perform a rite of passage for Joan, respecting the Catholic faith of the family. To spare the parents the trauma of identifying their daughter's body, an FBI agent who lived in the neighborhood made the official identification. The autopsy revealed the horror that Joan went through. The girl had been beaten, strangled, sexually, abused, and beaten to death. The medical examiner determined that she remained unconscious but alive for at least 30 minutes before dying. He also found that the killer probably wasn't sure Joan was dead after the first strangulation, and, to make sure, performed a second one, evidenced by 2 distinct injuries in the neck area. According to McGowan's confession, he asked Joan to enter his house saying he needed change to buy the cookies. When she showed resistance to going down to the basement with him, McGowan grabbed her and forced her into his room. Although he insisted that he never completed the act, McGowan admitted to becoming aroused, ejaculating on his own fingers and then forcing them against Joan. The proof was in the evidence. The girl's underwear contained her blood and his semen. The medical examiner confirmed the hymen rupture, a rape regardless of the form of penetration. Then came the moment of cold decision. She could not leave there alive. Joan would be able to identify him, would tell everything. His life, his career as a teacher were at stake. Initially, he strangled her on the bed, but thinking about the practicality of cleaning, he dragged her to the tiled floor and continued until she stopped breathing. Believing he had killed her, McGowan went to get dressed. He was sweaty from the effort. He fetched plastic bags from the garage, and upon returning realized with horror that Joan was still moving. What followed was a brutal demonstration of murderous determination. He strangled her again, placed plastic bags over her head, and, when blood began to flow from her nose and mouth, he beat her until he was absolutely certain that life had drained from that small body. McGowan used old t-shirts to clean up the blood, wrapped the body in an old rug, placed it in the trunk of his car, and drove to the park to dispose of the body. On the way back, he threw the bag with his clothes and the rug into a trash bin. Upon returning to the neighborhood, he cynically joined the search for Joan. In his testimony to the psychiatrist, McGowan said that, as soon as he returned home, he began to feel better for having disposed of the body and was able to sleep very well. Joseph McGowan, 27 years old, was a chemistry teacher. Although he didn't have many friends, he had co-workers. The teachers who taught with him found him strange. He had mentioned a fiancée, but never introduced her to anyone, and the relationship had ended shortly before the crime. One colleague reported that McGowan found humor in things that weren't funny, sometimes morbid. He was so unpopular among other teachers that during that Easter week, several of them organized a group trip and deliberately didn't invite him. He was also known for being a brown-noser to the administration and reporting colleagues for minor infractions, such as leaving a door open, which made him an unpleasant figure in the workplace. Most students apparently liked him, but later, after his arrest, some girls reported discomfort in his presence, saying he looked at them strangely and was sometimes violent in demonstrations with other female students during science classes. the psychiatrist who evaluated him, concluded that McGowan presented a significant history of sexual attraction to young girls, along with the clear and evident scenario of a dominant and overprotective mother. This indicated deep problems in relating naturally to adult women, which could have been a contributing factor to his deviant behavior. In his sessions, McGowan admitted to having felt attraction to a 12-year-old cousin who slept at his house, and to a girl who sat on his lap when he was a camp counselor at 19. These incidents, although they did not result in criminal actions at those times, already demonstrated the disturbing pattern of attraction to minors that would culminate. In the attack on Joan McGowan, and his lawyers decided to waive a trial, and he pleaded guilty on June 19, 1974. During the hearing, Rosemary noticed something disturbing. McGowan's mother, Genevieve, was staring at her with looks of pure hatred. Later, Rosemary would discover through a mutual acquaintance that Genevieve blamed little Joan for her son's fate. If it weren't for her, Joseph would never have killed and wouldn't be in prison. A perverse inversion of reality, where the murdered child became guilty and the murderer a victim. On November 4th of that same year, McGowan was sentenced to life in prison, but with a disturbing legal loophole: the possibility of parole. After just 14 years, a flaw in the system that Rosemary would tirelessly fight to correct in the following decades. Joan's funeral took place 2 days after the discovery of her body. School friends and Girl Scouts sent cards of condolence. However, as time passed, Rosemary found herself alone in her grief. She still had 2 children, Mary and Frank Jr., to raise, and did everything possible so they could continue having a normal life. Mary wanted to be a Girl Scout like her sister, and despite the pain it caused, Rosemary supported her, not wanting the trauma to negatively affect her daughter's choices. The family decided not to move from the neighborhood, as it would be too drastic a change after the trauma. This meant that Rosemary could see the house where her daughter was murdered daily, a constant reminder of the tragedy. She tried not to be overly protective of her other children, allowing them to play in the street and have a normal childhood, despite her own suffering. She talked openly with them about what had happened to Joan and took them regularly to the cemetery to visit their sister, who was in heaven, keeping Joan's memory alive in the family. Instead of hiding the truth, Rosemary talked openly with her children about Joan. Regularly, she took them to the cemetery, explaining that their sister was now in heaven. It was her way of keeping the memory alive, of teaching that love remains, even after death. The shockwaves of the tragedy continued to reverberate. 7 months after the murder, Rosemary's father, who deeply adored his granddaughter Joan, died of cancer. Doctors suggested that the emotional shock accelerated his physical deterioration. It was a second devastating loss. 1 year after losing her daughter, as if fate wasn't satisfied with her suffering, Rosemary was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a cruel autoimmune disease that causes debilitating muscle weakness, intense pain, blurred vision, slurred speech, and difficulty chewing and swallowing. Doctors never categorically stated it, but suggested that extreme trauma could have triggered or accelerated the condition. Despite the tragedy and the disease, Rosemary had 2 more children in 1980 and 1982, Michael and John, who joined the already teenage Mary and Frank Jr. in 1987 due to sentence reduction. McGowan became eligible to request parole, which was denied. In 1993, Rosemary began an active campaign to prevent him from being released and to change the legislation. She organized vigils, marches, and events to remember what had happened to Joan and to warn about the vulnerability of children. During 3 years of full-time activism, Rosemary transformed her pain into concrete action. Her perseverance finally bore fruit on April 3, 1997, when Governor Christine Todd Whitman, wearing a green ribbon on her lapel, Joan's favorite color, signed the historic Jones Law. This legislation fundamentally altered the New Jersey Penal Code, ensuring that anyone convicted of murder with the aggravating factor of sexual abuse of a child under 14 years of age would receive life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The impact of Rosemary's struggle transcended state borders. On October 30, 1998, President Bill Clinton signed a federal version of Jones Law, extending protection to children across the country. 6 years later, on September 15, 2004, New York Governor George Pataki symbolically chose Harriman State Park, the same place where Joan's body had been found, to sign the state version of the law. Unfortunately, McGowan would not be affected by Joan's law, as it could not be applied retroactively to crimes committed before its enactment. He continued to request parole over the years, always denied thanks to Rosemary's efforts and the support of professionals like John Douglas, former FBI agent and pioneer in criminal profiling. John Douglas became known for his work interviewing serial killers and developing criminal profiling techniques, being one of the founders of the FBI's behavioral science unit. His work inspired characters in The Silence of the Lambs and series like Mindhunter. Douglas interviewed McGowan in depth, using his technique of informal conversation without notes to gain the prisoner's trust. What Douglas discovered was chilling. McGowan confessed that the moment he saw Joan through the glass door, he knew he would kill her. He described two types of anger: red, which he could control, and white, uncontrollable. When asked which he felt upon seeing Joan, he replied without hesitation, "White." When demonstrating the expression on his face during the crime, McGowan displayed what Douglas described as an intense and evil smile of satisfaction, revealing the pleasure he had felt in the brutal act. McGowan also revealed something that demonstrated his calculating nature even after decades in prison. He had more than $600,000 saved in a bank in New York State from the inheritance left by his mother and grandmother and from the sale of the family home. He explained with a certain pride that he had transferred the money to another state specifically so that Rosemary could not access it through civil lawsuits. Thus, he ensured funds to continue his legal battle for freedom. Douglas was so deeply impacted by this interview that he later wrote an entire book dedicated to the case, The Killer Across the Table. His professional conclusion was unequivocal. McGowan continued to represent a serious danger to society. The story of Joan D'Alessandro is not just the story of a horrible crime, but also of how a mother transformed her pain into action, creating a legacy that protects other children. Joan's law ensures that predators like Joseph McGowan spend the rest of their lives in prison, without the possibility of returning to the streets and causing more harm. A curiosity about the case is that a singer named Nolan Neal wrote a song in tribute to Joan with touching verses that say, "Johan, send me a butterfly and let it be the color of your eyes. Show me a shooting star. In the second I'm wondering where you are." Let me hear our favorite song the next time I turn on the radio. If you're up there on the other side, send me a butterfly. The social butterfly, as her teacher called her, who didn't like to see anyone alone, who settled fights and had empathy for everyone, had her life brutally interrupted at 7 years old. But her name and her memory continue to live on through the laws that protect children across the country, a tribute to the love of a mother who refused to allow her daughter's death to be in vain.
So, what did you think of these 3 mysterious cases? Leave your theories in the comments and suggest what other cases you want to see here on the channel. If you enjoyed it, hit that like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss any mystery. Until the next video.